One of the first large-scale visual and gameplay updates was Sejuani, who received a full rework alongside the visually reworked Trundle back in Season 3. She is the tank of the Freljordian sisters, and she has always been good at that job. But was she too weak, and thus required not one but multiple reworks? Or was she too strong and required some nerfs to her abilities and added counterplay? Well, both of these might be true, but to answer it definitively, we're going to need a deep dive on Sejuani before her rework. And so without... Wait, can you hear that? Sounds like shadows creeping on me. Legendary ones on a raid? Must be the sponsor of this video, Raid Shadow Legends. Raid Shadow Legends is one of the most popular mobile games of all time with over 80 million downloads, and for very good reason. I love the vast amount of combinations you can make with the insane number of champions and customizations available in game that lets you battle it out against bosses, dungeons, and even PvP the way you like. Here, you can use my QR code on screen now, or the link in the description to download Raid on your mobile phone or PC. Speaking of bosses and stuff, the action is what draws me to Raid. Never-ending action is guaranteed with the sheer multitude of battles available. Head into various dungeons to challenge all sorts of intimidating bosses, and with an awesome campaign and many floors of the dreaded Doom Tower to explore and scale, there's truly no shortage of perilous PvE to try your hand against. And if that isn't enough, with high-stake PvP fights and faction wars, your insatiable thirst for battle can easily be quenched here in Raid. For me, I love all of the above, but if I had to pick one, you might already know I love me some big boss fights. There really is nothing quite as cathartic as triumphing over an insurmountable foe, is there? Now, get ready for the 12 days of Raid! Get Raid from the link on screen, copy your player ID from in-game, enter your player ID and prepare for a fun, festive 12-day adventure. But don't worry, it's lasting from December 19th and all the way to January 10th. Each day you play, you can experience a new chapter of this story and play a new minigame for a chance to win some wonderful prizes, both in-game and real life, including holiday-themed Raid champions, as well as even Amazon gift cards worth up to $1,000. And if you're an existing Raid player, you're not being left out. Head to the website where you can find a special holiday promo code that everyone can use as a festive gift. Raid's got something special happening again, and this time they're releasing a special legendary champion based off MMA and pro wrestling legend Ronda Rousey. And you can get Ronda Rousey in game for free right now, whether you're a new player or a longtime fan of Raid, just by logging in for 7 days between now and February 28th. And new players, listen up. When you use my link in the description or scan the QR code on screen, you can get your hands on a free starter pack with all of this in-game loot. Find your rewards up here in the inbox within the next 30 days. Thank you once again, Raid Shadow Legends, for sponsoring this video. Here is the Sejuani we know now. But before her rework, League of Legends had something like this instead. Indeed, she looks like any generic fantasy game female character, and that's because that's kinda what League of Legends was like back then, even if the Freljord is quite, well, cold. Though these looks of hers prompted visual changes for her upcoming rework, let's look at the gameplay side of her. Sejuani's original passive was Frost, which simply caused her basic attacks to slow enemies by 10% for 3 seconds. This was as simple as it gets for an ice character, but like other champions such as Anivia, the debuff had further interactions later in her kit. Before that, her old Q was Arctic Assault, charging forward to deal damage and apply frost to all enemies they pass through. All small enemies hit would be knocked aside, and the boar Bristle would only stop at max range or when colliding with an enemy champion. You may have noticed, it doesn't knock up enemy champions at all, it just applies frost. Sejuani's old W was Northern Winds, summoning an icy storm around her for 6 seconds, dealing magic DPS. The damage increased by 50% against enemies affected by her passive or her E. Speaking of which, her old E ability was Permafrost. It detonated any frost debuffs applied to enemies, dealing damage, and slowed them further by 30% to 70% for 3 seconds. Her ultimate was Glacial Prison, a powerful ability that threw her weapon in a line, exploding on impact with an enemy champion or at the end of its range. All enemies in its large blast radius would take magic damage, apply frost, and be stunned for 1 second, or 2 seconds for the main target. This was a very powerful ability thanks to its range and CC, with a 10% slow applied after the stun, and it could be easily extended and enhanced by activating her E. Her basic play was to apply Frost to as many enemies as possible with Q and W to activate her E, slowing all enemies and dealing damage. This may sound incredibly underwhelming compared to what we're used to, largely due to her Q not having any kind of stun by itself. The only part of her that seemed really strong was her ultimate, and that's going to be a running theme for, well, all time, actually. So, with problems all around, Sejuani needed modernization on all fronts. Sometime after the first visual and gameplay rework for Karma, Sejuani and Trundle had reworks of their own announced, and they were received on April 2013, patch 3.6, alongside the release of her sister, Lissandra, for a huge Freljord update. The patch gave Sejuani many stat buffs in addition to some upgraded abilities, clearly reminiscent of the old, but given impactfulness and scaling more modern for the time. Sejuani's newer passive was Frost Armor, granting her bonus armor and slow resistance when she hits an enemy. Her reworked Q, Arctic Assault, was improved in a few ways that made her more similar to modern tanks, and even some of the more time-tested old tanks. The damage now scaled with a percentage of the target's maximum health, and displaced enemies she and Bristle knocked into. In other words, knocking them back. It's really weird looking back at the original ability, which had no displacement whatsoever, and the scaling with enemies' health helped Sejuani not fall off when building tank, similar to another old tank champion, Amumu, whose W scales the same way. The new W, Flail of the Northern Winds, empowers her next auto attack with bonus magic damage to all enemies around the target, and then, when used or recasted, Sejuani swings her flail to deal magic DPS to enemies around her for 4 seconds. The damage now scales with Sejuani's bonus health rather than maximum health, helping to encourage a tanky build rather than AP, and setting a stronger trade-off for building her AP. It also no longer dealt bonus damage to enemies impaired by Frost. You see, the Frost passive still exists, it's just on her new E, Permafrost. The E passive is the same as her old passive, applying Frost as a debuff, but not slowing enemies itself. The active Permafrost was similar, but dealt a greater slow for a shorter duration. Her ultimate remained the same, but with a 2-second stun duration up from 1.5 to 2 seconds based on level, and slowed secondary targets for 90% if the projectile reached maximum range. The reworked Sejuani had scalings that complemented a tank playstyle much better. AP ratios remained for a fun playstyle, and she could kinda work with items like Liandry's Torment, but the intended build paths are quite clear. With damage scaling with enemies' max health as well as her own bonus health, some more effective CC throughout her kit and not just loaded into her ultimates, Sejuani had far more impact in general than any 10% slow could hope to achieve. And she was able to stay this way for a long time, even with rather large gaps between patches. But although she didn't need much adjustment, it didn't mean she didn't have problems. Supposedly, her pick rate was rather low and she became a fairly unpopular champion. And so, a second gameplay rework was introduced. Her new passive was Fury of the North, which granted her Frost Armor if she hadn't taken damage in the last 9 seconds. Frost Armor gave her slow immunity and 100 armor and magic resistance, plus doubling her total armor and magic resistance. Don't worry, we'll come back to this. The second passive of Fury of the North freezes enemies stunned by Sejuani, causing her next basic attack or ability against them to deal 10 to 20% max health magic damage, or 400 flat to small enemies. If the 100 armor and magic resistance on a passive seemed a bit crazy, don't worry, Riot agreed with that and then nerfed it in the next non-hotfix patch. Speaking of which, yeah, she also had 2 hotfix nerfs in the same patch. Let's get back on with it. Her Q took a few changes, mostly buffs around costs and cooldowns, but nerfs to the base damage and the knock-up with its duration and its AoE, now only knocking up the first target hit. This made way for her new W, Winter's Wrath. Ditching the AoE DPS entirely, she now has a 2-part skillshot W, first swiping horizontally in front of her, and then a linear lash with more range in the same direction. Both swings scaled with her own maximum health, but second strike was much stronger, and also slowed enemies it struck. While casting this, Sejuani can move freely to help aim the attacks. This maintained her W as an AoE ability for the sake of clearing, but gave her some more range to play with, and some opportunity for counterplay and engagement from her opponents, Moreover, the multi-hit helped build up her new E. The reworked Permafrost now caused all of her own and her allies' basic attacks to apply frost to enemy champions and large monsters, also counting the 2 hits of her new W. When an enemy had 4 stacks of frost, she could activate the ability to damage and stun them for up to 2 seconds. Her ultimate, Glacial Prison, had a slight upgrade as well, still slowing enemies around its main target by 30%, but now after the 2-second storm, it shatters to deal a large amount of magic damage with 80% scaling, and slowing all enemies in the area by 80% for 3 seconds. The added aftershock of damage and slow rewarded Sejuani not only stunning enemies by hitting them with a projectile, but keeping other enemies in there with her other abilities as well. It did not take anything away from her ultimate, but added more engagement other than just throw it to initiate. The large AP ratio also gave off-meta enjoyers something to look forward to, just requiring some good aim and lockdown to achieve. As mentioned, this rework prompted some nerfs and fixes in patches to follow, but overall achieved its goals without compromising too much. She kept her AoE, stuns, lockdown and initiation, and gained a powerful passive. All of the changes, including ones from her prior rework, worked towards front-loading her power. Most initiating tanks are, and likely should be, front-loaded. They work to get in close, bursting enemies not with damage but with crowd control. Her new W got its damage and effects out quicker than the old 4-second aura, and that change too got the W to have more impact with its initial auto attack, rather than a simple click to activate 6-second aura. With Permafrost now stunning, the reward is more impactful and takes more work to bring out, allowing more engagement from friends and foes. With the application of the mark working with teammates' attacks as well, it helps to be a visual beacon to help Sejuani lead her allies not only into battle, but on who to target and focus. Charging in first, taking the lead, and commanding along with this more front-loaded kit really defines what Sejuani is, and perhaps what she should have been all along. Not to say she wasn't without her problems. First, as always, complicating a kit adds complications. When a kit is simple, some players gravitate towards its simplicity for that itself. The new Skillshot W may seem a little off-putting, but in my opinion, it's simple and easy enough to use, especially using after gap closing and knocking enemies with Q, that you don't have to really worry too much about it. If anything, the added range gives you more things to try. And of course, she received many nerfs after this because Riot were definitely in their release too powerful and nerf later mindset by this time. 100 bonus armor and magic resistance at level 1 is a clear sign of that. And though tanks are necessary for a game like this, especially with the power and mobility creep we've seen over the years, eons of crowd control can be just as horrifically frustrating as they are necessary. If Sejuani is strong and powerful, it wouldn't be too hard to hate her for locking you down, especially when she isn't the hardest champion to use mechanically. In fact, she was pretty popular very recently in Season 12. With the power of the old mythics Sunfire and Frostfire, she was taking Graspity and dying in the top lane, and with her mobile Q and great CC for escapes, she often didn't take Flash, instead taking Ignite to help her win her fights in the lane. And her popularity may have played a part in her receiving 2022's Victorious Skin, awarded to those who got gold or higher in ranked queue. As you might be able to tell, I am a fair fan of the Sejuani reworks. After coming back to the second rework, I was hesitant to accept it as I really liked the old one, but just a game or two in, I quite liked it and the new W. But that is just my opinion, and I'm much more interested in hearing from you. What do you think of the Sejuani rework? How about the older one? Or the original Sejuani? And how do you feel about the new Victorious skin? Let me know in the comments below. Shoutouts to the members OKJ, Nashborn, Awesome Toyoda, Light, AJGBeat91, Warsquid, Genocide, Ultimate Ground, Kaide, Boblax, Luxus, My Dad, Unknown22, and N Era for supporting the channel. Thank you again. Sa ala sa te lavi.